Here he is, friends. He got his suit back just in time. And no matter what happens in his life, he gets absolutely no respect.
They called him the King of Late Night, but Johnny Carson's stage wasn't always smooth. It was unpredictable, chaotic, and sometimes downright shocking. One guest sent the audience into uncontrollable laughter with a single throw, while another left him scrambling as a wild animal got too friendly. These moments weren't scripted. They were raw, live, and unforgettable. And one moment in particular is so unforgettable, people still wonder if it really happened. Ed Ames' tomahawk throw. When people talk about the funniest moments in late-night history, one clip almost always makes the list. It happened back in 1965, when actor and singer Ed Ames appeared on The Tonight Show. Ames was promoting his Western series Daniel Boone, and to make things interesting, he brought along a tomahawk. Johnny, always the showman, set up a wooden cutout of a cowboy and asked Ames to demonstrate his frontier skills in front of a live studio audience. Ames stepped forward, aimed carefully, and hurled the tomahawk. But what happened next was pure television magic. Instead of hitting the chest or the head of the target, the tomahawk stuck squarely in the wooden cowboy's groin. The sight was so perfectly timed and so unexpectedly hilarious that both Carson and the audience completely lost control. For more than 3 minutes, laughter rolled through the studio, louder and louder, while Ames stood by in disbelief and Carson leaned into the chaos with his signature smirk. Carson, of course, knew exactly how to elevate the moment. As the laughter refused to die down, he delivered one of the most famous one-liners of his career. "I didn't even know you were Jewish." The timing was flawless, and it sent the room into another round of uncontrollable laughter. The clip has since gone down as one of the longest sustained laughs ever captured on television. A perfect storm of accident, wit, and audience energy that no script could ever recreate. And just when you think you've seen how unpredictable Carson's stage could be, along comes another unforgettable guest whose collection of potato chips led to one of Carson's sneakiest pranks ever. Myrtle Young's chips prank. Every so often, Johnny Carson liked to shine the spotlight on everyday people with unusual talents or quirky collections. One of the most memorable guests to ever fit that bill was Myrtle Young, a sweet-natured woman from Indiana who worked at a potato chip factory. Myrtle had a sharp eye and a sense of humor, and over time she had built an entire collection of chips that looked like other things, like faces, animals, and strange little shapes that sparked conversation. By the time she appeared on The Tonight Show, her unique collection had already gained attention in newspapers, but no one was prepared for what Carson had in store. As Myrtle sat beside him, she carefully laid out her prized chips on the desk. Each one was different, and Carson listened with that twinkle in his eye as she described how she found them and why she saved them. The audience was intrigued, laughing softly at the novelty of it all. But then Carson picked up one of the chips and casually began to examine it. Without a word of warning, he lifted it toward his mouth and crunched down loudly, pretending to eat one of Myrtle's rarest pieces. For a split second, the studio froze. Myrtle's face turned to shock. The audience gasped in horror, and it felt as though Carson had just destroyed a beloved artifact in front of millions. But then came the reveal. He hadn't touched one of her real chips at all. It was a regular potato chip he had swapped in, a decoy, and the entire room erupted into laughter and applause as Myrtle's expression shifted from panic to relief. That quick prank became a textbook example of Carson's genius. He didn't need elaborate props or rehearsed skits, just a clever setup, a perfectly timed misdirection, and an audience willing to follow him right into the joke. And speaking of timing, few people knew how to throw off Johnny Carson's rhythm quite like comedian Don Rickles, who once barged onto the set in the middle of someone else's interview. Rickles crashes the set. One of the most unpredictable guests in Tonight Show history was the legendary insult comic Don Rickles. Rickles had a style unlike anyone else, loud, brash, and completely unfiltered, and whenever he crossed paths with Johnny Carson, the result was late-night magic. Their most famous clash came out of a running gag that started in the simplest way possible, a broken cigarette box. Rickles had been filling in as a guest host on The Tonight Show when, in the middle of his usual antics, he managed to break Carson's beloved cigarette box. which sat on Johnny's desk night after night. By the time Carson returned and noticed, he couldn't resist making a moment out of it. Instead of letting it go, he decided to confront Rickles live on air, turning what could have been a backstage conversation into one of the funniest surprises ever caught on television. Carson stormed onto the set of Rickles' sitcom CPO Sharky, barging right into a scene in progress. The audience had no idea what was happening at first, but Carson marched straight toward Rickles with the broken box in his hands, demanding an explanation. Rickles, never missing a beat, immediately launched into mock defensiveness, claiming innocence with that wide-eyed, over-the-top delivery he was famous for. The two went back and forth, improvising on the spot, throwing playful jabs that had everyone doubled over in laughter. What made the moment unforgettable was the chemistry between the two men. Carson played the straight man perfectly, pretending to be outraged, while Rickles thrived on pushing him further and further. It was completely unscripted, completely chaotic, and completely brilliant. And if Don Rickles thrived on chaos, the next guest to hit Carson's stage brought an entirely different kind of energy. In fact, his very first appearance remains one of the most electric debuts in late-night history. Robin Williams' first appearance. When Robin Williams first sat down on Johnny Carson's stage in 1981, audiences were introduced to a kind of comic energy they had never quite seen before. At that point, Williams was best known for playing Mork on Mork and Mindy, but live television gave him the perfect stage to unleash the whirlwind of improvisation, voices, and physical comedy that defined his style. From the moment he walked out, it was as if a storm had blown into the studio. Williams didn't wait for questions or setups. He simply launched into a non-stop stream of characters, impersonations, and wild physical movements. One second he was mimicking a Russian weightlifter, the next he was doing a perfect British aristocrat. And before the audience could catch its breath, he was bounding across the stage like a hyperactive child. His mind seemed to be firing faster than the camera could follow. And Carson, a master at handling unpredictable guests, suddenly found himself in the rare position of being almost speechless. Carson tried to interject, but Williams was already 3 jokes ahead, shifting his voice, flipping into another bit, and keeping the crowd roaring with laughter. The audience was in absolute hysterics, clapping, cheering, and doubling over as if they knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. You could see Carson watching him closely, half stunned and half delighted, recognizing in real time that this wasn't just another comedian making a late-night stop. This was a once-in-a-generation talent. That debut wasn't just funny, it was career-defining. Within a single appearance, Williams cemented his reputation as a rising star and a force of nature who could dominate any stage he stepped onto. And while Robin Williams brought uncontrollable laughter, another unforgettable moment in Carson's career came years later, when a beloved guest brought him to tears. Bette Midler's emotional farewell. As Johnny Carson prepared to step away from The Tonight Show after 3 decades, the atmosphere during his final week was unlike anything television had seen before. Night after night, beloved guests stopped by to pay tribute. But it was Bette Midler's appearance on his second-to-last show in May of 1992 that carved itself into history. Midler had always been a favorite on Carson's couch, but this time the tone was different. She wasn't there just to joke or promote, she was there to say goodbye. With Carson seated only a few feet away, Midler began by singing "Here's That Rainy Day," a ballad filled with bittersweet nostalgia. The lyrics carried an unmistakable weight in the context of Carson's farewell, and the audience listened in hushed silence. Then, almost as if she couldn't let the moment end on a purely somber note, she turned to him with a smile and launched into "One for My Baby and One More for the Road." She sang it directly to Johnny, strolling across the stage with her trademark charm, playful but deeply heartfelt. Carson, who so rarely let his emotions show, was visibly moved. His eyes welled up, and the audience could feel the gravity of the moment sinking in. When Midler finished, the studio erupted into a standing ovation, not only for her performance but also for the man whose reign on late-night television was drawing to a close. That performance is remembered as one of the most poignant send-offs in TV history. It captured everything Johnny meant to his audience: laughter, warmth, and finally, an unguarded glimpse of his humanity. But if Carson's farewell brought tears, Another moment from years earlier brought absolute chaos. Joan Embry's Animal Runs Wild. Over the years, The Tonight Show introduced audiences to countless celebrities, but some of the most memorable guests weren't human at all. Thanks to Joan Embry from the San Diego Zoo, Carson's stage regularly turned into a miniature safari, with everything from baby elephants to exotic birds making surprise appearances. The magic of these segments was simple. No matter how carefully Joan tried to control the situation, animals always had a mind of their own, and Johnny knew how to milk every unscripted second for comedy. One particular visit left the audience gasping and laughing in equal measure. Embry brought out a long, muscular snake, and Johnny, trying to keep his cool, leaned in to take a closer look. At first, everything seemed calm as Joan draped the reptile carefully over his hands. But then the snake began to slither, slowly sliding down toward his lap. For a moment, it looked as though the creature was about to wrap itself right between his legs. Carson's face told the whole story, part nerves, part shock, and part absolute mischief. The audience erupted in laughter at his discomfort. And without missing a beat, Johnny delivered one of those quick one-liners that only he could pull off. If only in real life. The crowd roared. Embry tried to keep the animal under control, and Carson somehow managed to turn his near panic into one of the funniest moments of the night. But Carson's unpredictability wasn't limited to wild animals. On another night, chaos came from a very different kind of creature when singer Paul Williams decided to surprise Johnny in a way no one could have seen coming. Paul Williams appears in orangutan costume. Late-night television has always been a stage for eccentric surprises, but Paul Williams managed to deliver one of the strangest entrances Johnny Carson ever introduced. Known for his songwriting genius and frequent television appearances, Williams decided to take things to an entirely new level when he showed up on The Tonight Show dressed not as himself, but as Virgil, the orangutan character he played in Battle for the Planet of the Apes. The makeup was elaborate and convincing, the kind of full Hollywood prosthetic that could take hours to apply. When Williams shuffled onto the stage, completely transformed, the audience wasn't entirely sure how to react at first. Then Carson, sensing the absurdity of the situation, leaned right into it. Instead of treating Williams like the Grammy-winning musician he was, Johnny began addressing him as if a real ape had wandered into the studio. He asked questions, threw out quick one-liners, and riffed on the bizarre situation with his trademark coolness. The longer the bit went on, the funnier it became. Williams stayed committed to the character, answering in grunts, gestures, and exaggerated expressions, while Carson played the perfect straight man, holding the conversation together as if this was a perfectly normal late-night interview. The audience howled at the ridiculousness of seeing two professionals sell the gag so completely. That night blurred the line between guest and character, creating one of the most surreal moments in Carson's history. And if seeing a guest in full movie makeup felt unusual, Carson's comedy took an even sharper turn in another unforgettable bit that turned the biblical story of Adam and Eve into a divorce courtroom. Adam and Eve divorce skit. Johnny Carson wasn't just a master at interviews and off-the-cuff comedy. He also thrived in sketches that let his wit and timing shine. One of his most memorable came when he teamed up with fellow comic actress Betty White for a sketch that reimagined one of the oldest stories in the world, the tale of Adam and Eve. But instead of paradise in the Garden of Eden, this version landed the famous couple in a courtroom fighting out a divorce. Carson, dressed as Adam, sat at the defendant's table with his familiar look of weary resignation, while White played Eve with sharp, comedic confidence. The setup was simple but brilliant. Thousands of years after the first bite of the apple, the first man and woman were now facing a judge to divide up their possessions. From the moment the sketch began, the audience was laughing at the absurdity of seeing biblical figures squabbling like a modern couple in family court. The punchline, though, came with the verdict. The booming voice of God served as the judge, and when the decision was read, the audience erupted. Not only did Eve receive everything, from the garden to Adam's personal belongings, but in a perfectly sharp twist, she was also awarded Adam's rib, the very bone she was created from. Carson's expression of disbelief sealed the joke, and Betty White's triumphant grin pushed the laughter over the top. What made the skit stand out was the combination of clever writing and Carson's impeccable timing. He had the rare ability to take an ancient story everyone knew and twist it into something modern, funny, and relatable, while still keeping it lighthearted enough for television. And while this sketch showed off Johnny's scripted comedy, his stage also became the launchpad for a new generation of unscripted voices, including a young man making his very first appearance who would later become a late-night legend in his own right, David Letterman's first appearance. When David Letterman made his very first appearance on The Tonight Show in 1978, it was clear that late-night television was witnessing the arrival of someone special. At the time, Letterman was a young comedian still trying to find his footing, known mostly to comedy club crowds and for the occasional television spot. But stepping onto Johnny Carson's stage was the ultimate test, the platform that could make or break a comedian's career. From the moment he sat down, Letterman's style stood out. His humor wasn't delivered with the smooth conversational ease that Carson had perfected. Instead, it was dry, sarcastic, and tinged with just the right amount of awkwardness. He leaned into irony and self-deprecation, almost daring the audience to laugh at his discomfort as much as at his jokes. This was a completely different rhythm than the polished comics Carson often featured, but that contrast was exactly what made Letterman so compelling. Carson, famously selective about who earned his approval, watched closely, and it didn't take long for his smile to give him away. He clearly saw something in Letterman, a sharpness and originality that made him different from the rest. The audience responded too, warming quickly to Letterman's offbeat style, laughing at his subtle digs and dry punchlines. Years later, Letterman himself would step into the role of late-night icon, but it all began with that night on Carson's stage. And while Letterman's debut was sharp and understated, another guest chose to go in the exact opposite direction, delivering sheer absurdity in the form of balloon animals that defied every expectation. Steve Martin's absurd balloon animals. By the late 1970s, Steve Martin was already carving out his reputation as one of the most unconventional comedians of his era. Where many comics relied on polished punchlines and tight storytelling, Martin thrived on turning comedy inside out, making jokes that were intentionally awkward, surreal, or in some cases, hilariously bad. His appearances on The Tonight Show gave him the perfect stage to showcase that style. And one of his most memorable bits involves something as simple as balloon animals. Instead of twisting balloons into perfect dogs, swords, or giraffes like a circus performer, Martin leaned fully into failure. He would inflate a balloon with dramatic flair, twist it a couple of times, and then hold up the lopsided, unrecognizable result as if it were a masterpiece. With a straight face, he'd proudly announce the creation of a dog or a swan, even though it looked like nothing more than a tangled mess of rubber. The comedy wasn't in the balloon animals themselves. It was in Martin's absolute commitment to the absurd. The worse the creations looked, the funnier the routine became. Carson, who loved sharp, original comedy, could barely contain himself. At one point, he doubled over in laughter, wiping his eyes as Martin continued with deadpan seriousness, producing one ridiculous animal after another. The audience roared with each attempt, fully in on the joke that the humor came from the deliberate lack of skill. That bit became a defining example of Martin's anti-comedy brilliance, showing that sometimes the funniest thing you can do is fail spectacularly, as long as you sell it with confidence. It became a reminder that The Tonight Show wasn't just about jokes, but about letting performers bring their own unique brand of chaos to Carson's stage. Speaking of chaos, Carson himself once delivered an impersonation performance that had the audience howling. Johnny Carson impersonates Willie Nelson. Johnny Carson was never known as a singer, but every once in a while he loved to step out of his usual role and dive headfirst into parody. One of the most surprising musical moments came when he decided to impersonate Willie Nelson. With a red bandana tied around his head, long braids dangling on either side, and that unmistakable country swagger, Carson walked out looking like a late-night version of the red-headed stranger himself. The bit went even further when Julio Iglesias joined him on stage. Iglesias was in on the joke, but Carson played it straight, committing fully to the act. Together, they performed a duet with Carson strumming along and leaning into Nelson's laid-back style, exaggerating the voice just enough to keep the audience laughing while still keeping the song recognizable. What made the moment work was the contrast. Iglesias, the suave international star, next to Carson, the king of late night, doing his best Nelson impression without breaking character. The audience loved every second, clapping along and laughing at the sight of their usually sharp-suited host transformed into a country legend for a night. And while that performance was planned, one of the biggest laughs came from a guest who showed up when Johnny wasn't expecting him, an action star who decided to make his entrance a surprise. Arnold Schwarzenegger's surprise visit. By the 1980s, Arnold Schwarzenegger was already one of the biggest movie stars in the world, known for his action roles and larger-than-life physique. But when he made an unannounced visit to The Tonight Show, he reminded everyone that he wasn't just a muscle-bound action hero. He had a quick wit and a natural comedic charm that could light up a room. Arnold strode onto Carson's stage with that trademark grin, immediately taking control of the moment. Without any build-up or introduction, he launched into playful banter, flexing his arms, joking about his size, and tossing out quips in his thick Austrian accent. The surprise was part of the fun. Carson had no elaborate setup prepared, so he slipped into his favorite role, the straight man, letting Arnold's antics carry the segment. The chemistry was effortless. Arnold poked fun at himself and at Carson, and Johnny responded with that sly, understated humor that always made the laughs land harder. The audience roared at the unexpected pairing, watching an action superstar prove he could hold his own in the world of comedy just as easily as on the big screen. That visit showed a different side of Schwarzenegger that audiences rarely got to see in his early career. Beyond the action roles and bodybuilding fame, he had charisma, timing, and a natural sense of fun that made him unforgettable on Carson's stage. And if Arnold's surprise showed the playful side of a Hollywood star, Johnny's next encounter brought something entirely different. Carson meets baby orangutan Oliver. Animal segments were always a gamble on The Tonight Show, but sometimes they produced moments so pure and funny that they became instant classics. One of the most unforgettable came when Joan Embery from the San Diego Zoo introduced Johnny to a tiny orangutan named Oliver, barely 2.5 months old. The moment Joan placed the little primate in Carson's arms, the audience collectively melted. Oliver clung to Johnny with the kind of trust you'd expect from a newborn. And then, to everyone's surprise, he wrapped a small arm around Carson's shoulder, as if the two had known each other for years. The audience erupted in laughter and warm awes, charmed by the natural bond forming right before their eyes. Carson, of course, knew exactly how to keep the laughter rolling. He glanced at Oliver's relaxed face and delivered a perfectly timed quip, making it clear that the orangutan looked a little too comfortable under the bright studio lights. The crowd howled, loving both the sight of the tiny animal and Johnny's quick ability to spin the moment into comedy without ever missing a beat. That short segment has gone down as one of the most beloved animal appearances in Carson's history for its sweetness, spontaneity, and Johnny's genuine affection for the creature. And while that night was all about tenderness and laughter, another famous Carson moment revolved around something far less adorable: a nationwide panic over something as ordinary as toilet paper. Carson's monologue on toilet paper shortage. Johnny Carson's monologues were legendary for their sharpness. Night after night, he could take headlines, odd news stories, or simple quirks of everyday life and turn them into pure comedy. But one joke in 1973 showed just how powerful his words could be and how easily laughter could spill over into real-world consequences. At the time, there were already murmurs in the news about shortages of certain goods due to supply chain concerns. Carson picked up on this and, with his usual straight-faced delivery, tossed in a gag about toilet paper running out across the country. But while the audience laughed, viewers at home didn't all take it as a joke. By the next morning, stores across America were swamped with frantic customers who had cleaned the shelves of toilet paper. The panic buying was so intense that it actually created a real shortage, something that hadn't existed before Carson's monologue. Newspapers covered the story, store owners complained, and Carson himself later had to clarify that he had only been joking. Still, the damage was done. For weeks, Americans struggled to find roles, all sparked by a single throwaway line from late-night television. This bizarre chain reaction stands as one of the most striking examples of Carson's influence. He was just making people laugh, but his platform was so massive and his audience so trusting that even a simple joke had the power to ripple across the country. And after 3 decades on the air, Carson's final goodbye wasn't just another television sign-off. It was a cultural farewell that left millions in tears. Carson's final goodbye. After nearly 30 years at the helm of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson delivered one of the most poignant farewells in television history. On May 22, 1992, the curtain closed on an era that had shaped not just late night, but American culture itself. Millions tuned in that evening, knowing they were about to witness the end of something that felt bigger than just a TV program. Carson's final show wasn't filled with flashy surprises or elaborate stunts. In fact, it was the opposite. There were no gimmicks, just Johnny, his audience, and the quiet dignity that had defined him throughout his career. Sitting at his familiar desk, he reflected on his time, thanked his viewers for their loyalty, and spoke with a sincerity that few had ever seen from him on air. The man who had spent decades delivering jokes and laughter now spoke from the heart. As he brought his final monologue to a close, Carson uttered the words that would echo long after the broadcast ended. "I bid you a very heartfelt good night." The studio audience immediately rose to their feet, delivering a standing ovation that seemed to stretch endlessly. Carson smiled, nodded with grace, and walked off the stage for the last time. That farewell remains one of the most dignified exits in television history. Carson left at the height of respect, admired by fans, peers, and generations of entertainers who followed. It wasn't just the end of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. It was the end of an era, and it remains a moment that defined how a legend says goodbye. Which of these moments surprised you the most? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.